Welcome to this second episode of Global Conversations on Reimagining and Reshaping the Future of Democratic Governance, brought to you by New Visions. My name is Ikram bin Saeed. I am a co-founder at New Visions, and today I am your host. At New Vision, we believe that really democracy must and can deliver dignity and justice. But clearly, we are living in an age where the facade of democracy still stands. Elections happen, parliament seats, yet real decisions are being made elsewhere. So maybe they are made in the quiet of creditors' boardrooms or the technical annexes of reform packages, or perhaps in the spreadsheets of institutions few citizens can name, let alone influence. And the result is a world where governments are accountable often to lenders, investors, rating agencies, and less to their own people. Democracy really exists in forms, not anymore in substance. And if you share with me this feeling, well, let me tell you, welcome to the choiceless democracy when people vote for different governments, yet they face almost the same choices and they have been asked all the time to tighten their belts again. So today's conversation will unpack who really holds power in debt-driven democracies, how austerity erodes sovereignty and trust, and how grassroots and feminist alternatives are reclaiming the future. And for you, our listeners that joined us despite your busy schedule, my intention and my hope that you leave this conversation with one of the three things: either a new idea or a new perspective on seeing things, or a spark of inspiration, or hopefully just a little bit of courage to question the current global order. So let's dive in. I am very honored to be moderating this debate. My speakers aren't just experts. They are really leaders of both resistance and imagination. They have challenged institutions from within institution and outside, and they bring the clarity and the courage we need to make sense of this world and change it. Rob Davis, he's a former South African Minister of Trade and Industry. He is also former Member of Parliament. Currently, he is a honorary professor at the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance. He is also the author of Toward a New Deal, Political Economy of Times of My Life. Rob was an anti-apartheid activist and a member of the South Africa National Liberation Movement. We are also honored at New Vision to have Rob Davis as our board member. Hello, Rob. Eric Toussaint, a historian and political scientist. He is a spokesperson of the Committee of the Abolition of Illegitimate Debt International Network. He is also the author of several books, World Bank, A Critical History. I personally highly recommend this book. The Debt System, A History of Sovereign Debts and Their Repudiation, and the Life and Crimes of an Exemplary Man, among other influential works. Welcome, Eric. Shireen Talat, Egyptian feminist economist and director of MENA Fem movement. Shireen is one of the global leading voices on decolonial feminist economic frameworks. She is also a filmmaker. Her award-winning documentary has inspired policy change, including Egypt child law reform. أهلا وسهلا يا شيرين. And Jérôme Fleps, he is the head of policy and advocacy at the Justice. Jérôme has worked also in migration sector as a director of detention action and the International Detention Coalition. Jérôme's writing has appeared in Jacobian, Tribune, and the New Internationalist. Thank you all for joining us. And let me start with Eric Toussaint. Eric Toussaint, you have studied the World Bank and the IMF more closely than almost anyone. So let's begin there. I really want to invite our listener to imagine ourselves as if we are in a boardroom of the IMF and World Bank. Let's pull chair and Eric explain to us who actually makes decisions at those institutions. What are the political interests that inform those decisions, and whose sovereignty is being protected? This is my first question for you, and you have 5 minutes, and then I will ask you another question. To you, Eric. You are muted.
Yes, it is very obvious that you have a very narrow club of countries, of powers who are deciding in this institution. I would say it's to the bloc led by the USA, either in the IMF or in the World Bank, and composed by Western European allies of the USA and Japan. This little nucleus has the power, and mainly, principally, the government of the United States. As you may know, since the beginning of the World Bank in 1944, each president of the World Bank has been a US citizen, including Ajay Banga, who is the president of the World Bank. Since the beginning of the IMF, it is a European who is leading. But in fact, the US is making the decision inside the IMF. An example, for instance, this year, the IMF decided to lend money to a friend of Donald Trump, Javier Milei, in Argentina. The IMF decided to lend $20 billion in April 2025, after having lent $45 billion in 2018, and plus more $45 billion in 2023. In this opportunity, the leadership of the IMF, the staff of the IMF was not very happy with this the pressure by Trump on the leadership of the IMF. But at the end, you have had an unanimous vote in favor of lending 20 billion to Javier Milei to help him to try to not to lose the election, which will take place next weekend. This money was not sufficient. The World Bank also decided to lend $12 billion the same year. And a week ago, Trump announced that the US Treasury will open a credit line to Javier Milei for another $20 billion. I have contact inside the leadership of the IMF, and people told me that several of the executive directors knew perfectly that this decision was not in the interest, including of the institution, because the level of debt of Argentina is totally unsustainable, and Argentina will not be in capacity to pay back the IMF. So that's an example. It's important also to say that the 45 countries of sub-Saharan Africa have only together 5% of the vote, when Germany have more than 5% of the vote. The USA has 16% of the vote. And you may know that when there is a vote inside the IMF and the World Bank, and when there is difficulty debate, the majority required is 85% of the vote. That means that the US has a veto power inside the leadership of the IMF and the World Bank. So they are really undemocratic organization, and the pressure the pressure at the political level is evident. I imagine that Shirin will say something about that. Now, inside the IMF, you cannot anymore speak about policy of gender equality, struggle against climate change, etc. Because Trump has said it is no more part of the mission of the IMF.
Of the World Bank. But
and
Eric,
the
explain
World
to
Bank,
us,
but also
explain
the
to us,
IMF.
yeah, explain to us,
Yeah.
was it designed this way, the system, and why it was designed this way? We all know that it's
Yes,
undemocratic,
I
but why
think
it's
that it was
undemocratic?
designed. Yeah, it was designed by the administration of Roosevelt, which was maybe the less conservative administration in the US history in the 20th century. But it is clear that this administration want to reorganize the world after the Second World under the leadership of the USA. And these two institutions were designed to guarantee to the USA the control on the two institutions. So there has been several reforms about redistribution of vote, but in reality, the US and its allies are controlling the decision, and the little reform about voting rights are really something which has no concrete which has no concrete consequence at the level of democratization of these two institutions. So my answer is that they have been, since the beginning, designed as instrument tools in the hands of the USA. In the beginning, because you had this policy of Keynesian policy of the Roosevelt administration, there was some intent of controlling movement of capitals, asking the IMF to do that, and progressively it has been totally abandoned, and the two institutions were used to avoid any extension of intent of endogenous way of developing the peripheral economies. So the countries who tried to implement endogenous model of development without taking too much debt and without opening too much economies were in opposition to the IMF and the World Bank, and the IMF and the World Bank react with the US government against this government. For instance, Sukarno in Indonesia, overthrown in 65, or João Goulart in Brazil in 64, and the list of countries where the IMF and the World Bank supported financially dictatorship after the overthrow of a progressive government. This list is very long, from Argentina in 76, Pinochet, Chile in 73, and we can take several examples in sub-Saharan Africa, of course.
Eric, I have a follow-up question for you based on what you recently said. In your book, The World Bank, Critical History, you say that the World Bank doesn't just lend money, it lends ideology. Those institutions are perceived as technical institutions, they work for the development. But you say in your book that they also lend ideology. What do you mean by that? And if you can give us concrete examples.
Yeah, it's clear that under the government of Ronald Reagan, Thatcher, etc., the model designed by the World Bank and the IMF and supported by them was directly linked to this offensive of neoliberal policy, in total opposition to Keynesian policy or socialist policies. And it's clear that this ideology is very important for the World Bank and the IMF. They are building a theory around development, telling that it is impossible for a country to develop itself without taking debt and without attracting foreign capital and opening the economies. And it's very contradictory to what is happening now in the present world, because as you know, the USA and Trump, but it began with Biden administration, decide to increase protectionist policies and to abandon the free trade policy. Trump decided to paralyze the WTO. I imagine that Rob Davids will speak about that. But at the same time, in direction to the peripheral economy, the IMF leadership and the World Bank are still saying you should absolutely open your economies. And this structure of production of peripheral economies are incapable to resist the exports either from the Western countries or from China. Of course, China now is playing a very important role in Africa, in Latin America, and with its neighbors in Asia. And China now is in favor of free trade, and Europe, the old Europe and the US are opposed. But the ideology of these two institutions is still in favor of the free trade, because for the peripheral economies, free trade give in reality advantages to the most advanced economies of the Western traditional powers and also to China.
Thank you very much, Eric. We'll get back to you after I finish my tour with the other speakers. Rob Davis, I want to turn to you now to speak a little bit about sovereignty under pressure. You have been a former member of parliament, but also Minister of Trade, and I believe you negotiated a lot with the World Trade Organization. We want to leave the hallway of the IMF World Bank, and we want you to take us behind closed doors. What happens inside the governments when creditors come and knock on the doors, but also how those global forces, IMF, World Bank, I think you will speak more to the World Trade Organization, reshape domestic priorities. To what extent you really have have a margin of democracy under this pressure? And Rob, you have to open your mic, please.
Yeah, I think I would start by saying that, we in South Africa had our democratic breakthrough at a particular moment in history, which happened to be that of the advance of hyperglobalization and neoliberalism. And I think that this was also reinforced by the end of the Cold War and the so-called unipolar moment when the US became the uncontested single global hegemon, and its writ and what it said needed to happen in economic governance became the norm right across the world, imposed in various ways. But I think I want to just mention in one thing that I think is quite important, just to go back to some basics. Acquiring debt is not a bad thing in itself. If you're going to make long-term expenditures of a capital nature, you're going to invest in infrastructure as a country, or a firm is going to invest in machinery and equipment, you borrow the money in order to do that, and then you pay it back over a period of time. And so you have a set of institutions that come in with apparently that role. I think what has happened during the period of hyperglobalization and neoliberalism is that we've had a process which has been called financialization, where instead of providing a service to productive activity in economies, actually what's happened is financial institutions, financial sectors across the world have actually started to prey on those productive activities to make huge profits for themselves at the expense of the rest of the economies, and get the rest of the economies to restructure in such ways that they have to resort to financial transactions on an increasing scale, get involved in borrowing money and debt and so on and so forth, to an extent that leverage is being created by these financial institutions. Now, South Africa is not actually particularly badly affected by that, but I think it is quite important to look and see what's happened to Africa over the last few years. So after COVID, after things like the disruption of the supply of wheat from Ukraine to Africa and other countries, countries in Africa have increased their debt exposure. And you can look at any number of figures on this, just Google a few of them. But it's got to the point where there are 25 of the 54 countries in Africa where debt service, that means the paying back of the debt at whatever was agreed to, plus the interest, all of this is now exceeding the expenditure on health and education in those countries. And when you come to a situation like that, what does global finance capital tell you? It doesn't say to you, well, actually, health and education are critically important, therefore they should be priorities. It doesn't tell you that. It tells you the opposite. It says debt service is the priority, and you must just do that, even if it means that you must undermine your health and education. And so they impose a set of policies which are not just, I think, ideological in the sense that they don't represent anybody's interests. They are ideological in the sense that they tell you that the biggest and first and most important priority is to make sure that finance capital around the world gets what it wants, and that the policies that you have to have in place in your domestic economy have actually got to be structured in such a way as to make sure that that is the case. Now, I think that there's a little anecdote that I want to mention. It comes from Europe, actually. And it was Yanis Varoufakis, who used to be the finance minister for a while of Greece under the Syriza government. And the Syriza government was elected on a platform of anti-austerity in Greece. Greece had been going through this austerity budgeting, cut in order to achieve financial ratios. And he went into the European Union and he said, look, colleagues, we've got a problem here. We were elected on a mandate against austerity. That's our common collective challenge that we now face, is how we're going to deal with this. And the answer he got, which was plainly expressed, was just because Greece has had an election doesn't mean it can change its economic policies. And I think that is the gist of it, is that there's a one-size-fits-all set of economic policies. They are about prioritizing liberalized financial sectors. By the way, at the level of sectors in the past under capitalism, you could have had centers of production excellence, like the Boeing company making excellent engineered planes, or Cadbury's making excellent chocolate. Once the financial engineers get in, financial engineering overtakes aircraft engineering, and you start getting shoddy planes that crash, and this has been investigated, or you start getting chocolate that becomes cheapened by introducing other bits and pieces into it, and that financial engineering means that the interests of finance capital dominate over everything else. The World Trade Organization, yes, was part of the story, because what was wanted as globalization was unfolding, particularly driven by finance capital, and the desire for capital to be able to move around the world in and out as it saw fit, into wherever it wanted to go, and to exit as quickly as it went in. Was it wanted free movement, but free movement of all the so-called factors of production, capital, goods, and services, but not people. No free movement of labor around the world. That was a no-no. But this free movement of capital and of goods and services was certainly promoted through the WTO and others. So there was a rules-based trading system, but the rules were the rules that were authored and led mostly by the United States, but also by its allies in Europe. They were the ones that wrote the rules. At that stage, they were the industrial powers. They didn't face a challenge at the level of industrial competitiveness that they now face from China. Now that they do face that, the rules they crafted for everybody else no longer suit them. And they're jettisoning them one by one unilaterally, whilst they continue to tell the rest of the global south that they must continue to adhere to the rules. And so I think the classic example is what we've seen this year, where the entire WTO rules book has essentially been thrown out by the actions of the Trump administration, both through its tariffs that it has imposed on specific products like steel, aluminium, pharmaceuticals, automotive products, those things, and also then its so-called reciprocal tariffs, which it's imposed on every country in the world practically, a global supplementary tariff. And as far as developing countries are concerned, what's not noticed so much is that what's exempted from all of that is the supply of raw materials. So what they want to do is they want to restructure relations with the world, trading relations with the world, to the partisan benefit of the United States. And with developing countries, they want us to regress back to the position where we supply raw materials for use in somebody else's industries rather than creating value addition. That's the agenda that's been going around. Now, it's not an agenda, I think, that any longer commands much support in the world, nor is it an agenda that is able to promote unproblematic development and expansion, growth, or anything like that. Not development, just growth. It can't produce that anymore. The financialization has produced a financial bubble, which burst in the Great Recession of 2008. And I think that we can see that really the capitalist world economy has never really recovered from that. The ideological glue that held this project together has begun to unravel ever since that time. And I think we're now facing the situation where there's a very, very serious divergence between what people want and desire and the model of what's in place. But at the moment, though, the power relations are still such that they can impose, particularly through the instrument of debt and indebtedness. So if you are highly indebted, then you are subject to the conditions that they impose. And those conditions are that your domestic policies must be those that are going to be able to maximize the ability for you to repay your debt. And that is going to be your highest consideration. And that means that they are going to expect you to find get all your ratios into the neoliberal playbook. Your budget mustn't exceed 3%. You must cut inflation, all of those things. And then on top of that, we're now persuaded that since we don't have any money any longer, the way we can turn billions into trillions, supposedly, is go to the private sector and private institutions, where we're supposed to go around and de-risk and guarantee them high profits.
Sorry to interrupt you, Rob, but when you speak about this pressure faced by governments because of the conditionality, because of the austerity, is there really still a democratic space when almost everything is top-down? And you and me had this conversation before that many governments now are really becoming procurement department when they are really outsourcing major policy issues to global firms without naming names. But many governments are not really so to what extent we still can have a democratic debate within this global financial order? And if you can speak to some example that you face, you as a minister, for example.
Well, I think the point is that as long as the order prevails, democracy will be constrained. But people don't want that situation to prevail, and the order is now entering into an increasing crisis. I think that's the choice you face. But of course, if you and it's not imposed, it's imposed indirectly, and it's imposed because some parts of our societies actually benefit from the system that we've got. So what happens is that if your financial sector is particularly strong and influential, as it is in South Africa, those people want to be able to manage funds that start off by the savings of people in South Africa, pension funds and whatever. They want to use those funds to invest, and they want to use that investment across borders as well. The mainstay is the United States. They want to get into the Wall Street nexus and be there, and probably have in your mix US property securities and things like that. And then if you want to play in that game, then you get the rating agencies that we were mentioning earlier on. The rating agencies will give you a grading, and you will want to advance your grading. You won't want to be going down. And if you want to advance your grading, you're going to have to introduce policies that they are supposedly going to like. And those are generally the policies of neoliberal austerity. That's what happens. And so you see that most of our finance ministries, most of our central banks and the African continent, most of them believe in this sort of game. They go to the IMF, they go to the World Bank. They are a very small constituency. They can't influence the decisions there. On the African continent, they're in two very, very small constituencies. They can't shape the decisions, but they probably believe in the broad idea, and they will be told, and we are told now, that if you want to invest in infrastructure and you are in a deficit situation and you are facing austerity and all of that, the way you do this is that you de-risk. You go to the private sector. It's called the Wall Street consensus, which is different from the earlier Washington consensus. You go to the private sector. You try to encourage the private sector to come in, take over your infrastructure by stealth, liberalize your sectors, guarantee them profits. That profit guarantee probably includes some element of subsidy, but in the developing world, not so much that. But what you're going to do is you're going to guarantee them a high return by allowing them to serve the upper income markets, remove any kind of obligations to provide services to low income people, and that you are then hoping that that is going to, as the phrase goes, turn billions into trillions. And that's what's been offered by way of climate finance. Any development project is this is what's been held out. But the problem is it doesn't work, because they don't want to come in and invest in water in South Africa or renewable energy in Ghana and get a rate of return less than if they were engaged in financial speculation in the United States. They want the same return. So it is, as I think the phrase goes, a high cost, low yield option, which really has failed to deliver resources to infrastructure build programs. And so countries that have attempted, South Africa is one at the moment, countries that have attempted to follow this route of trying to get private sector investment to come in and solve our infrastructure gaps, it's not happening on any scale. And so we're stuck in low growth, we're stuck in stagnation, and in anything that does happen is targeted to the higher income markets. And I think it is the fact that there are interest groups in our countries that benefit from this system that is why we have it today. And so the state, as you were saying, the neoliberal state came in and it said the state is totally unable to deliver anything. The role of the state is simply to procure services from the private sector. So various institutions around in our country, that it was kind of indirect. People were, what's best practice? So best practice generally meant fire the engineers in the whatever department it is and replace them by procurement officers who are going to manage tenders that are going to be coming from the private sector. Well, that's also very often, and the case in South Africa is the case, that's the entry point of corruption, is the tender. And so we have a double whammy. We have to pay, we don't provide the services ourselves, we withdraw from all of that. We manage tenders, those tenders become a source of corruption. That weakens the capacity of the state yet again. And so the solution becomes privatize, privatize, privatize.
Yeah.
And then you get a situation where if you want to vote for one or the other, you can vote for some party because you like the face of one candidate or the rhetoric of the other candidate. But whatever you vote for, you get the same economic policies in the end. That's the neoliberal state, and that's the state that I think is now in crisis.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rob. It seems like we're really in a cycle that it's very hard to break. Let's move now to Shireen. And so Shireen, let's bring this conversation down to the people's everyday reality. When governments adopt austerity to satisfy creditors, who really loses control over their lives? How do women, informal workers, and frontline communities experience truly the collapse of sovereignty? When healthcare is cut, we heard from Rob about the privatization, subsidies are vanished, and also civic spaces are shrinking more and more. Over to you, Shireen.
Thanks a lot, Ikram, and thanks also for my fellow panelists for the insightful interventions. Well, as you already know by now that across the Global South and the MENA region, austerity has become the new face of colonialism. And authoritarian regimes comes with austerity. So it doesn't now, colonialism doesn't now arrive in tanks. It comes through spreadsheets, loan agreements, reform packages, and government sign, parliaments comply, and citizens pay. So this is exactly how sovereignty dies in silence. We in the MENA region is actually facing multiple crises day by day. And definitely, as all the impacts are not neutral when it comes to women, as austerity and debt are not neutral when it comes to women. But let me put you in a bit of context. For example, in Egypt, in 2016, Egypt signed 3 years IMF loan around $12 billion. It came with strict conditions. By the way, the IMF is reviewing its conditionalities nowadays. And there will be an open consultation, and there was different consultations, written consultation that was submitted by the civil society, but yet we already know what will be the outcomes. Going back to Egypt condition, the 2016 loans that came with the strict conditions, actually people are still suffering from the 2016 condition now in 2025 at this moment. So it came with currency devolution, subsidies cuts, طبعا, that expansion, and public sector wage. By 2022, Egypt signed another 3 billion program with same measures. So imagine people who are living from 2016 to nowadays to 2025 under this conditionalities, how that impacts their life. According to the different studies, one of them was recently produced by MINAFEM. The gender policies of the IMF the climate policies of the IMF has a real bad impact and harmful impacts on women. Those conditionalities, those policies also shape those conditionalities. So the Egyptian pound that lost half of its value, pushing inflation above 30%, poverty actually climbed over 32%, and 36% of families' income was affected and doesn't cover their monthly needs.
Shireen, sorry,
Yes.
can you fix a little bit your camera? We cannot see you.
Oh, can you
Sorry.
see me now?
Yes, thank you.
I'm sorry. So women always pay the high price. This year, 13 women workers on the farming sector, part of them are students that working to support the breadwinners of their family, or students supporting their families or themselves as well, lost their lives because of austerity measures. And there is a specific road in Egypt that became now the death road for people that is suffering for day to day trying to earn their breads. But for example, in 2024 there was a study I contributed with Nuria at Nuria is a research center. The founding of this report that Egypt austerity that reducing harmed women by reducing employment opportunity, increasing unpaid care burdens, and deepening inequality. Women in Egypt perform 4.7 times more unpaid care work than men, according to the UN Women in 2022. This unpaid labor keeps families afloat while still طبعا retreats. Austerity became also a governance without consent, as policies were negotiated with the IMF, not debated in parliaments. Yani public accountability vanished under austerity. As a result, Egyptians experienced democracy as formality and empty ballot box overshadowed by fiscal decrease. And the thing that austerity is not only killing women in Egypt, but it's actually impacting people everyday life. We saw in other places in the region. The past 2 weeks, the past month actually in Morocco wasn't super easy. After the death of 7 women in one of the hospitals of the public hospitals in Morocco, and they were doing a very simple operation that a lot of women do, which is actually giving birth because of austerity measures. I remember when Mina Fam was working on the campaign on eliminating surcharges, and surcharge here is more interests that is forced on countries in need and have problem in paying back, like Egypt, like Tunisia, from the region like Egypt, Tunisia, and Jordan. Those surcharges can actually be up to 100% of the loan itself. So it's a punishment that the IMF put to our countries. I remember, and in this specific meeting, when we were informed that this campaign is a successful campaign after 2 years of working, and the surcharges was reduced by 37%, but we weren't happy, because I can see a country like Morocco, who were coming out from an ecological disaster, the earthquake in 2022, then in 2023, pardon, and then floods in 2024. At this specific moment, Morocco was running to pay the debt interest for the IMF, rather than taking care of what is happening and the impacts of what was happening in Morocco because of this ecological collapse. You know why? Because Morocco didn't want to pay surcharges. This is how debt and austerity kills our people, and specifically women. And even in Tunisia, fiscal reforms also met resistance. يعني Tunisia, after 2016 IMF reforms targeted wage bills, subsidies, and public spending. By 2022, debt had reached over 80% of GDP. And interest pay absorbed nearly 20% of the national budget. And again, Tunisia was paying surcharges as Egypt and Jordan. And the consequences were very visible. Food and food prices doubled, etc. Women lost access to mobility, public health, and care service. Health sector in if Tunisia wasn't paying surcharges, actually this money that Tunisia paid for surcharges can actually reform the whole health sector in Tunisia.
Shireen,
Yes.
sorry, can you speak to us how does feminist resistance to those conditionality and policies look like in MENA?
Well, actually, the feminist resistance started from 2011 when women led protests and went to the streets in around the MENA region, Egypt and Tunisia and Morocco, to Algeria as well, actually, but Algeria is a different story. But to ask for bread and freedom and social justice. So bread and freedom and social justice was on the top of the agenda of all the liberation movements around the region. And let's not forget that feminists around the region are still fighting for their own lives now, as austerity becomes part of, from my perspective, of a gender targeted based violence. So the resistance is still there. Feminists around the region joined global efforts to reject the IMF gender policy in 2023. And still we are putting ourselves as part of this يعني not only MENA movement but global movement. We gathered in 2025 in Rabat, feminists from the MENA region with the global movement to put our agenda around how we see this multilateral system failing in front of our eyes and having double standard and gender blind. So we put our agenda and our roadmap, the Rabat roadmap that I will share later with you, and the Rabat declaration, speaking out about how we not only rejecting the harm, but we are putting our alternatives forward, our feminist alternative forward, because actually the new liberal economy model is not the only model that can be followed.
Yeah.
But there is a different, many different justice economy model that can be followed, and big part of it actually falls around the feminist political economy and the center care economy.
Thank you very much, Shireen. I think, as you said, women and through their domestic, unpaid, invisible work, they are really holding our lives together. It's like, basically, to paraphrase James Baldwin, the world is really held together by the love of few people. I think the world is held together by the unpaid, invisible work of women.
By the blood and body that women shed to save this world.
Thank you, Shireen. Because of the matter of the time, Jerome, I have a question for you, and then I have Last round for question for our speakers, and I will ask you please to be very brief because we have some question about imagination, bricks, and so on. So, Jérôme, my question to you is, what are the ways in which debt and austerity have undermined democracy and enabled the rise of repressive authoritarian regimes? Can you explain to us the link between this and democracy? Because many people, they don't see that link. Thank you.
Thanks, Ikram. Yes, it's a really important question. Really happy to join this webinar. So at Debt Justice UK, with the UK member of the Global Debt Movement, led by allies in the Global South, including MENAFEM. So we did some work with partners, including Shireen, on trying to understand the way that debt and austerity was landing in countries in the Global South around the world, and how this is what the impact is on has been on democracy there. I've put the link in the chat, and what we're seeing is really what's being described. This the way that debt crisis is used by the IMF, by the diktats of creditors to impose austerity on countries, and this leads to democracy being simply hollowed out. Governments become the contracting agents of the IMF. They can't meet the needs or address the needs of people, and they respond ultimately with increasing authoritarianism to cover up their lack of democratic legitimacy. And the source of this is the debt system built on the history of neo-colonial exploitation going back to colonialism, which has been put in place, as Eric explained, to reinforce these structures of dominance of global North capital. Today, there's still no functioning system for restructuring debts, which means that private creditors can hold out, insist on being paid off, and IMF can impose conditionality of brutal austerity as conditions of new loans in order that are lent to pay off the private creditors. So this leads governments tied into austerity policies, and elections as essentially choices of different agents of austerity. Governments become reduced to failing companies that are effectively controlled by their administrators. So we saw this in Sri Lanka, where a popular uprising in the context of economic meltdown, debt crisis, led to the Rajapaksa dynasty being driven out by the people. The unelected interim government did a deal with private creditors, but the elections last year led to a landslide victory for the left-wing opposition that who campaigned on a platform of standing up to the IMF. However, the new Dissanayaka government, within days, agreed to the creditor deal in full, even though it will keep Sri Lanka in debt crisis indefinitely, spending 20% of its revenue on external debt payments. The successful and radical platform of challenging the IMF was simply sidelined. And so what we're seeing instead is this growing popular disillusionment with governments that can't stand up to the IMF, to creditors, and increasing resort to, as we're seeing in Kenya, for example, to repression, to protests demanding dignified conditions of life, being met with arrests, shootings by police, increasingly authoritarian responses. Or the other approach, which Eric has alluded to in Argentina, where Milei won the elections by effectively promising to be the friend of Trump and the IMF, by posing with selfies with Georgieva, the managing director of the IMF, and he's followed through in terms of showing he can get emergency loans from the US when he's in a sticky electoral position, but he's not following through. He's still failing to stabilize the peso, Inflation is going back up. He's massively unpopular in the light of corruption allegations. This is accelerating undermining of democracy in many debt-ridden countries.
Thank you very much, Jerome. We are really running out of time, but I have last questions for you all. For our listeners, please stay with us because I think those are interesting reflection. So I will ask you all the questions. For Eric, I want you to tell us if there is a war to design post-IMF. Let's imagine a little bit. Post-IMF world order, what real multilateralism look like? For Rob, we want you to tell us if regional blocs like the BRICS, who represents nearly half of the world population, almost half of the world growth, can actually protect sovereignty, or are they reproducing really the same logic? To Shireen, what would sovereignty from below looks like? And Jerome, what gives you hope that sovereignty can be reclaimed? We start with Eric. Please, let's see.
I will be very short. I will say that it is very important to say that there is a better life without the IMF and the World Bank. And that we need to support any progressive democratic intent to develop another type of model of human development. There has been several interesting experiences in relation with the question of the debt to the IMF and the World Bank and other creditors. I was part of the experience in Ecuador in 2007, 2008, when the new government decided to organize an integral audit of the debt reclaimed to the Ecuador. And after we have made the audit, the government decided to suspend the payment unilaterally as a sovereign state, saying that they will not anymore pay back illegitimate debt. And it was a big success, confronting the creditors which were mainly in the part of the debt that has been suspended, US bankers and Ecuadorian bankers. It was a victory, and the government succeeded in increasing social expenses, creating jobs, and reducing the service of the debt. So I think part of the alternative is such a decision, sovereign decision of progressive government, and also to try to go back to the intent of creation of a bank of the South. What also Rafael Correa, when he was president of Ecuador, tried to do with Chavez, with Evo Morales, with Nestor Kirchner in Argentina, and in total with 7 presidents. I think that part of the future to have, we need multilateral tools, of course. I am not in favor of autarky. We need multilateralism, it's clear, but with other type of financial institution to support a new type of model.
Thank you very much, Eric.
Thank
so
you.
Basically, we really need to bring a new table and not trying to reform the current one. Rob Davis, very, very briefly, would the BRICS play an alternative role, or are they reproducing the same imperialist logic? Sorry, you need to unmute yourself.
So let me just say where I think we find ourselves. I think we're in, I want to take this very well-known quote from Antonio Gramsci. The old is dying, the old neoliberal order is dying, the new is struggling to be born, and in the interregnum, there's a variety of morbid symptoms. We're seeing many, many morbid symptoms. And I think it'll take some time before we get a new kind of stable, inclusive multilateralism, but we need to be very active in struggling for that. In the meantime, I think that what's going to be important is going to be a whole lot of institutional structures that are short of multilateralism, but which can start to prefigure alternatives. And I think the BRICS can be part of that. It's not a guarantee it will be, but it's starting to set out to say that we do not have to be tied to the dollar, at least as a tool of our bilateral trade. Eventually, that could lead into we don't have to hold dollars as our reserves. There can be other reserves. We don't have to be as dependent on those institutions that tell us how we have to run our macroeconomic policy. But another form of regionalism that's important is what we've got in Africa, the African Continental Free Trade Area, where I think that regionalism is going to be increasingly important in the next few years. It may take some time before we get into a stable multilateralism, but that's where we want to go. That doesn't mean that we're just going to rebuild the multilateralism as it existed. It's a multilateralism as it could be that we need to be thinking about. That would include a whole new, some people call it a new Bretton Woods conference, to map out a completely different architecture of financial institutions for a different world order.
Thank you very much, Rob. There is a very interesting paper on currency wrote by Eric. Currency and the BRICS, I highly recommend that. Shireen, what sovereignty from below will look like?
First of all, I want to say that I'm here in Mexico, and tomorrow we are having a delinking festival that I actually encouraging you all to join online. It is about how we can shape our realities, our world without the World Bank and the IMF, about the Bretton Woods institutions. And Rob, we are traumatized by the Bretton Woods name, so please another form, another name of the framework. And I have a lot of questions around the BRICS, but going back to what feminist sovereignty and from reclaiming democracy from below means. Feminist sovereignty actually starts when austerity ends. It means economies build around care, equality, and collective decision making. It means measuring success not by debt repayment, but by whether people eat, learn, and heal. It means actually revolving on care as the real foundation on social survival. In feminist terms, sovereignty is not about the flag. It is about who decides. Who decides how resources are distributed? Who decides what counts as value? Who decides whose lives matter? And women across the MENA region already is building sovereignty from below. Cooperatives in Morocco, from the High Atlas to the center of Rabat, sustainable agriculture and community waters, women unions in Tunisia, defending public sector jobs and social rights, grassroots networks in Egypt, sustaining aid in the economic anti-collapse. These are not just coping mechanisms. Those are democratic alternatives. They show that the struggle for economic justice is struggle for democracy itself. And actually, the feminist already movement from the grassroots levels is showing that we have alternatives if we go back to our roots. Thank you.
Amen. Amen, Shireen. Exactly. The struggle for democracy is the struggle for social justice. Jerome, what gives you hope that sovereignty can be reclaimed?
I think civil society campaigning around the world, there's been a huge global mobilization around the Jubilee campaign this year that MENAFEM and we have been involved with. There's been demonstrations, pressure from below. That's contributed to real pressure for change. For example, African particularly governments negotiated really hard at the Financing for Development conference for this pressure around moving debt decision making out of the creditors club of the G20 and the IMF into the UN, where global South countries have a voice by having a UN framework convention on debt. They didn't get it, but they got a foot in the door for that process. There's also lots of campaigning going on here in the UK for legislation to stop private creditors using the English courts to sue countries. for to be paid in full. So I think the pressure is on, and I think we can win some changes.
Thank you, Jérôme. Thank you, Eric, Rob, Shireen, Jérôme. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to all listeners who joined. Apologize for the delays, but I think the conversation was very important. We cannot talk about the new global order in only 60 minutes. I think the struggle is real. I think the world is really collapsing. The world as we know it is dying. And I think it's our responsibility to keep reimagining, to keep reshaping, and to be in solidarity with the struggle, because as you said, Shireen, the struggle for social justice is the struggle for democracy, and they need to be hand in hand. I think it's time that we put on the shelf the liberal democracy and we bring the substantive democracy, the democracy that delivers for dignity and for justice and for freedom, from Tahrir Square to Habib Bourguiba to Nairobi to Kathmandu to London to everywhere. Thank you all very much. And I hope seeing you again in another episode for our global conversation. Thank you.